Hello to everyone. You're all welcome. Today we come together for dealing with a labor session. Until now, we have conducted three sessions on education training and healthcare. And also, on the basis of the gender and migration perspective, all those topics have been digged deep into. And if you would like, and if you couldn't find the opportunity of personally attending those sessions, you could watch those on the YouTube channel of Kırkayak. And now I would like to give the floor to our moderator, Ms. Nilüfer Korkmaz. Are you all welcome? Kirk Agriculture team, I would like to extend my gratitude to you for organizing full session program, and previous sessions are really very fruitful and informative, and this would be like that. I am sincerely believing in that. And this program is organized by Kirkayak and supported, funded by Frederick Albert Foundation. And we would be focusing on labor today. We have two very talented speakers who will be together with us today, and they will keep us informed about Jordanian and Turkish examples, and also intersecting notions would be digged as well. And we will continue like that. At first, we will receive presentations. Right after that, we could discuss about that in a separate Q&A session, and we could pave the way for an integrated discussion if we proceed like that. Without wasting much of your time, let's get started with our first speaker, Sarah El-Hatib, and she is a site-based migration expert in MENA region, and she is a legal practitioner, graduate, has both graduate degree and undergraduate degree, and she has been working for promoting organizational rights and civil society rights and labor rights, and on the basis of all those, she tries to build up a collective strength in cooperation with workers and gender protection, human rights, worker rights are all within the context of her expertise covering 14 years old of a background in international arena as well. And she also worked in cooperation with the organizational structures of migrant workers in Jordan, the kafala system, which is an exploitative system. And she brought 10 Arabic origin women together in order to fight against that exploitative system, and domestic workers solidarity network has been established and promoted by her. And of course, she also attended some campaigns for promoting cooperation and collaboration in between activists and NGOs and migrant workers. There are really very good and fruitful products of those collaborative practices, and Jordan turned out to be the first member of International Federation of Domestic Workers and also Trade Union of Agricultural Workers organized a cooperative joint campaign with the stakeholders, and agricultural workers are ensured with the coverage of labor law, and they are entitled to benefit from the rights conferred open therein. And also, she was now focusing on alternative systems which will override kafala system, and that alternative system depends on human rights and worker rights and vulnerability of migrant workers are also addressed in this respect. I just give you some brief information about her, who is really very experienced in terms of NGO activities, and she is also really experienced and expertise in practice as a practitioner too on site. And Sarah, you also welcome, and I would like to give the floor to you. Please go ahead. The floor is yours. Thank you very much for introducing me in such a fruitful way, informative way. And now I would like to keep you informed about CCRM, international, regional migration, and refugee center. I am a member of that center, and I would like to keep you informed about migration works on the basis of our practice and experiences at that center too. And I would like to thank you very much. And I would like to thank specifically to Kirkayak team for having me. And I would be addressing social dimension of migration issues. You know that in the recent period, activists took a different action on the basis of gender sensitivities in terms of activists, in the eye of activists. You know that such like problems are really very of capital importance in Maksal and Afsal regions, where a huge number of refugees are hosted. And also in this presentation, the system which is dominant would be addressed, especially that system is dominant in Gulf countries and in our country, and those regions host millions of refugees. And apart from that, there are lots of foreign migrants in addition to the Arabic origin migrants or refugees too. And those are displaced people because of the challenges in their own countries, and they were forced to migrate because of political uncertainties and conflicts. And you know that women constitute a really very significant portion of those migrants or refugees. Once they get into the labor market, they are automatically integrated into that system. And that system is a sort of slavery indeed, a sort of form of slavery. And this is an appropriate working system, and they are deprived of their rights. The rights of mobility is eradicated, and they could not reach or access legal domain and other sort of services. And you know that migrants, refugees, displaced people are exploited by some employment offices, employment bureaus, especially in terms of local laws. They are obstructed in terms of their entitlements and rights. And in Lebanon, for example, there are women workers, and they are not subjected to the labor law. They are subjected to discrimination in some certain countries in terms of labor. If you take minimum wage into account or health insurances into account, they are exposed to discrimination by all means. And gender, labor, those are intersecting with each other, and women are mostly subjected to abuse and exploitation in Arabic geography. This is because of gender issues too. You know that women is always underestimated in Arabic territory. And in the society, roles of women are not ensured. The role of them does not get what it deserves. They are forced to work in houseworks only, and they could not join livelihood activities in order to make a living for household. That's why they are subjected to physical and psychological pressure. and even the number of university graduates with employment is too low in Arabic geography for the women. And also, due to economic conditions, indeed, their involvement is required, but in house of works, there are different methodologies of division of labor at work, at home. You know that women are always occupied. They are assumed indeed to be occupied with houseworks. This is the role which the society forces them to accept. And also, there are some foreign women who are employed at houseworks, which could be called as servants, house servants as well, and they are paid really very low salaries in return. And they are subjected to discrimination since they are migrants, they are lack of insurance, for example. And in private sector, they could be classified as professional workers, but those who work at home are ignored. Their labor is underestimated and does not get what it deserves. And servants at home, there is a huge number of such, like female women servants. They are restricted in terms of liberties, and they are also subjected to violence at home, for example. And we could say that a patriarchal um, tendencies are binding for them at home. Their passports are sized, and for example, they could not be provided with labor permits, and they couldn't, for example, get into contact with outsiders, so they couldn't go outside the home even during their off days or leisure time, so they couldn't get into contact with other workers, because if they are provided with permits, then they could get into an illegal fair. And that's why they are deprived of any mobility rights. And social relations, marriages are obstructed mostly. And apart from that, some migrants are employed in different sectors in line with kafalet system, especially they are employed in massage halls, beauty halls, agricultural sector, garment sector, and women are paid low salaries in those sectors to very low indeed, and they are also subjected to exploitation. They work for long hours and paid really very low low salaries in return, and they are also exposed to sexual abuse and exploitation. And those migrant women are also subjected to violations of rights, and they are lack of any networks which provide them with support, and they do not know language for under some certain occasions. They couldn't access legal services, and also they are subjected to victims of violence. They turned out to be, they turn into indeed victims of violence. And if, for example, they have a, an irregular residence, then they are subjected to even more pressure. If, for example, they are illegal migrants, this is the phenomena. And if their residence duration, deadline for the duration are not valid anymore, then they are under even more challenging processes for the time being. And migrant women
are not subject to exploitation just because they are women, but also they are workers under kafalet system, and migration as a deteriorating effect on their rights under kafalet system. The businessmen, the employers indeed could put a patriarchal pressure on them, and victims of that system are migrants mostly, and specifically the women hegemony could be exerted over the women even more than the men or male migrants. And they, due to their social identities, and for example, secular economic conditions or beliefs, they are subjected to even more pressure, and most of them are from poverty groups and least income groups. And we can say that those women should not be ignored more. And they, but on the contrary, your resilience is aimed to be eradicated, and also they work and create a livelihood for themselves, and also they could send money back to those living at their homelands, but they pay really very much to the agencies, intermediary guys, for example, and commissioners. So some of them are deported during the pandemic. Most of them could not have any income for long time periods, and they couldn't come back to their homelands because flights were stopped, and they couldn't get any tickets for going back to their homeland. Even though they managed to go back to their homeland, they couldn't find any employment opportunities and turned into be a member of the cluster of unemployed. And also, those migrants are mostly lack of health coverages, and they do not have regular income, and they are subjected to even more challenging conditions compared to the rest, and they could be deported uh, at any time and could be subjected to discrimination by all means. So the government for were addressed, and we got into contact with several governments in this respect by mediation of NGOs, civil society organizations, both at a national, domestic level and international level, in order to provide migrant workers with support. And in the beginning of the pandemic, humanitarian aids, we saw humanitarian aids and satisfaction of the needs. It was a really very important item which we should put in the agenda as the members of NGOs and CCR network prepare some campaigns in order to increase the resilience and in order to promote survival of those people. And we also aim to raise awareness among migrants, specifically women employees and women workers who work at housework or agricultural sectors are provided with awareness raising sessions. And also we try to cooperate with migrant groups in order to take preventive steps against their being infected. And also could say that gender sensitivity is a common pillar of our activities. FMA and CCR contributed to the Forum of Migrant Women, and they are established mainly by Asian migrants. And most important incentive or objective of this platform is to protect humanitarian rights of human rights and humanitarian entitlements of such like migrant workers. And also we take action in order them not to be exploited. And also statistics of them are kept in order to keep governments informed in order to support and promote such like migrant workers, and network provides some training programs, and also members of the network on the basis of the agreement number 196, which is indeed eradication of violence and abuse against migrants law. The provisions of that law should be realized in the real life, and network members took steps forward in order to achieve those goals. And also, social dialogue was enhanced as a result of each and every type of such like activities. And we could say that gender and especially social migration issues are addressed by uh, keeping a close eye on the pressure exerted over the women. And we could say that if, for example, the women would like to return to their homeland, then they could be supported for repatriation processes. And apart from that, kafalat system is intended to be eradicated, is intended to be cancelled as much as possible. And this is one of the most important aims of the network. And we cooperate with the Arabic stakeholders as the solidarity center of the network. And we aim to get migrant women organized in order to offer them alternative frames. And also we intend to improve their working conditions despite those challenges and problems, and worker trade unions, INGOs, also NGOs should focus on national and regional campaigns in order to put pressure over the government to support migrant workers, and in order them to act in parallel with the binding international agreements, and they are requested to take steps forward to take corrective action. And also we take steps for weakening kafalet system as much as possible. So we intend to trigger a reform process, and it is really very important for those migrants to be included to vaccination system. And we still need uh, developing that cooperation and collaboration. Thank you very much for lending an ear to me. This is all about my presentation. Thank you very much, Sarah. You also keep us informed about Kafalet system, which is a really very which has a really very significant adverse effect over the workers, and you also focused on gender issues. We would be discussing about that. It is mostly characterized as a system applied by Gulf countries, but it was also applied by some Western countries from time to time. I couldn't remember the exact date. For in UK, for example, once they started organizing such a system, carrying out such a system, then house workers were subjected to abuse, harassment, violence, and we would be digging deep into that later on, I think, like that. And now I would like to give the floor to Zeynep Ceren Nisoy, and she will continue with her own presentation. She was a graduate of Metro Sociology Department and in PhD thesis, the rural change process is restructured by the gender transformation. So the correlation and intersection in between each components were addressed by her within the context of the thesis by taking greenhouse workers, women workers, and their labor processes into account, and their integration into paid labor. And Global Research Fund within the context of that, she works in the social justice center and equality center, equality and justice center, and she also focuses on displacement issues in cooperation with international entities and labor processes and also gender, sexualist uh, characteristic of labor processes in Turkey, rural development, neoliberalism, ethnography of that, and politics are amongst the background of her, of amongst the interest areas of her. And now she would be keep us informed about migration, narrations, mobility in cities, and she will be addressing us now. And I would like to give the floor to you. I would like to share my screen with you now in order to follow up the presentation together with you. Okay, migrant domestic care workers in Istanbul, migration stories, working experiences, and practices, mobility in the city. I guess you all see my screen, right? Hello to each and every one of you. Thank you very much for having me and for your invitation and for organizing such a fruitful session. And in brief, as is mentioned previously by Miss Ludifer, I focus on rights, mostly human rights, and it is a really very broad project compared to what I will present here. We cooperated with women groups and also we worked with textile workers and we interviewed with textile workers. But here today, I would be focusing on domestic and care workers in Istanbul, and I would be addressing migrant workers mostly. At first, I would like to address what we concentrated on within the context of our project. We looked into the migration experiences of the women, and we have some specific themes. And one is related to the reasons and working practices, living practices. And in Istanbul, we have a sample cluster and where mobility in the public spaces in urban areas. But this project was designed before the emergence of the pandemic, and we did not have any clue about the pandemic, but the methodology of us was restricted in a really very dramatic way. And also we added a certain part onto it with regard to COVID's influence over the employment of the women. And also the coping mechanisms and strategies of the women with the COVID setting was also integrated into our report. And our here in study, our hereby study and others, for example, we have some partners in Iraq, Kurdistan, Pakistan, such like stakeholders cooperated with us. And if you would like to get more information about it, you could reach those information by those links on the presentation. I could indeed paste it, copy and paste it on the chat box later on if you would like to receive information about our international stakeholders too. And you know that mainstream migration literature especially focus on dynamics of migration from north to south. But here we focus on north to south, but also south to south migration, but especially we will be focusing on gender perspective. Apart from that, welfare state understanding was taken as a reference point and also care markets and also national and international affiliates in this process are all taken into account. And also economic conditions and reasons are overwhelming with regard to migration under some certain terms, but here
we try to shift that perspective and understanding. And to this end, we use social institutions and gender index as a framework to classify various discriminatory legislation and practices in female migrants, countries of origin, which may push women to migrate. And their lives before the migration and the gender inequalities to which they were subjected were also analyzed by us via our questions addressed to them. And also, we try to shed a light on their mobility in public spaces within the context of urban areas, but also we look into the influence of the COVID. And you know that care, migration, care regime, transformation of welfare regime, and also the agency of women from a gender perspective were all addressed by us. And in this respect, we interviewed with women. At first, we conducted face-to-face interviews, but after that, because of COVID, we organized our interviews via online means. In fact, at first, we assumed to reach a higher number of women, but because of COVID, that number turned out to be a restricted number. We also got into contact with two branches of Union of Domestic Workers, IMECE in Turkey, with the branch located in Istanbul and with the branch located in Antalya. And some of the women changed their mind and they didn't attend online sessions because online sessions lead to some restrictions and you couldn't build up the trust with them as a result. And you know that there is a really very huge literature with regard to care labor in Turkey, and we also benefited from that huge literature which is available here in Turkey. And I would like to skip it fast. I don't want to speak so long about each and every detail of the study, but you know that family is always an issue which happened to be a burden on the women. This is a continuous phenomena indeed. And you know that patriarchal system, gender, equality, stigmas are all integrated with each other. They are intermingling with each other, and that is ongoing side by side with the practices in, and because of that, women are turned out to be invisible groups, and their work and labor were underestimated. They turned out to be precarious labor, and that precarious working conditions, lacking of basic workers' rights, lead to gender-based and class-based inequalities, which happen to be more visible during pandemic periods, especially, and specifically that informal women employees are lack of special programs and aids and campaigns. They could not benefit from each and every one of them or any one of them. And indeed, once Turkey comes, when those women come to Turkey, they are integrated into a certain structure. Thereof, we should also address class differences and social class differences. Especially, we made mention of domestic migrant women, and there could be some class differences, especially that upper class ones coming from ex or former Soviet Union countries are employed as domestic border domestic workers. And for example, we could say that one-fifth of all work permits issued in 2017 uh, belongs to the women, and even there is a higher number of women who are lack of such permits and they are still employed at domestic works. And you know that those houses are assumed to be closed structures, self-contained structures. In case of any problems and injustices, harassment, you are not supposed to expose it because it should stay at home in a closed, isolated, hidden way. And when they work informally, if, for example, their passports expires, then they have a threat with regard to being deported, so they should conform with the conditions as much as possible. And there are some intermediary agencies or companies to which the women file an application in order to be supported for employment opportunities in Turkey. Um, they exert some pressure over them. They indeed exploit them mostly. But in this respect, we really have a huge literature available in Turkey. And in our sample cluster, we have 12 people, and most of them are from Georgia, Armenia, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and one from Philippines. And their ages are between 40 to 60 generally. Most of them are highly educated and six have high school degree. And also most of them work as a border or live in caregivers, while the others are employed as daily cleaner or child giver. And their occupation status in the country of origins is diverse from white-collar jobs to homemaker, agriculture, or factory worker. And most of them have residence permits, but only 3 women have work permits. 4 married women, while the rest is composed of divorced, separated, single, and widow. The majority have children whose number changed from 1 to 4, and they have a long duration of stay in Turkey, and the least the duration of stay is corresponding to 3.5 years in Turkey, and the longest duration of stay is corresponding to 21 years, something like that. And if you take the reasons of the migration for the women, we could categorize them under some certain factors. The first is economic factors, and the second is gender discrimination. So a combination of those factors lead them to be displaced, to flee away from their homeland. Economic collapse, shrinking job market, as well as high employment rates, or in Soviet Union countries, transition to capitalism, for example, war or conflict related long-term economic stagnation periods or devastated economic conditions. Indeed, they've made mention of all those factors, but apart from that, are even more than that, other than one woman, all the rest said that they were subjected to forced marriage, domestic violence, and also they are subjected to a high burden of houseworks under really very unjust terms. And also their husbands works only by their own discretion artificially. And also we could say that they try to escape from the husband or the father from the time in order to trigger, in order to get involved in a self-realization process, which is directly related with their own future projection. So this is a really very important thing. And I would like to give an example with regard to a live-in caregiver coming from Turkmenistan, and she was married by after a rape story, which lead to a marriage. She was forced to get married with the rapist of her. She said that she explained us that in order to flee away from the father and those kinds of experiences, she fled away from that homeland, and she would like to be a physician by means of by a doctor by means of the money which she could accumulate here in Turkey, which she could collect here in Turkey. And general
görüyoruz kadınların istihdam
characteristics of women employment, if you take those into account, women can move from one sector to another, even though they were employed as domestic and care workers at the time of research. For example, some could be first employed in tea agro fields at Black Sea region, but they could get into communication with the employers and they could also start working in Istanbul as caregivers, within the context of domestic labor. And there are some certain patterns in finding jobs in the care market, for example. They also create a migrant network. Those migrant networks is the most important means of finding jobs in the care market. Also, they could make use of relations of the previous employers, and finally, they could get into communication with agencies, intermediary agency companies or agencies. And informality. There are only 3 women that have work permit with social security and therefore access to health. And you know that at home, the labor practices are fairly are quite different. And it is a really like a closed box. It is a really very hidden and isolated setting, and they could be subjected to intense control, like talking by phone is subjected to a permit by the employer for most of them. And also there could be some pressure with regard to gender equality and oppression. And they could be seen as a threat by the woman of the household, for example. So they could be dismissed from the job as a result. And there could be some physical complaints of women as occupational diseases because they are subjected to heavy chemicals and they have to hold weight, for example, and also they are been through psychological challenges, but under such adverse settings coming to here, achieving migration process, earning money, making a living here, uh, or touching lives of the family left behind, sending the children leaving homeland to school, are deemed to be gainings for them by them, and they feel proud of that. So that we shouldn't take them into account only as passive victims. And we could say that during pandemic there could be some changes. Domestic and care workers and migrants. There are different experiences of daily workers and live-in workers. And daily workers mostly use their daily jobs, assignments. There's this through for housekeepers. They could be dismissed. They could not find any employment opportunity, or they start working and living as live-in workers too. But live-in workers said that we didn't lose our employment opportunities, but our working conditions changed dramatically, so the workload increases really very much, and everyone is at home all the time, and that also creates a further and extra burden on them. And especially live-in women, live-in workers could say that they, if they have a good relation with the employer, and they could access COVID tests, and they could find a place to stay during quarantine, any potential quarantine periods, or they could reach a required medication. If for so, it is really a very determinant factor, the type of relation with the employer, because you do not have any inspection mechanism, overlooking mechanism. They are distant away from any rights, official rights. So we could say that this is somehow arbitrary, of an arbitrary process. And we could say that there could be some stigmatization, transmitter of the virus as transmitter of virus. So that leads to house confinement. So they are imprisoned at home, they're captured at home, and they couldn't get outside of home anytime during pandemic. And I would like to keep you informed about domestic confinement, house confinement. All the needs are satisfied, all the needs of the interviewee has been indeed satisfied, but they employers could not trust her with regard to the virus. They assumed that she could be a transmitter of the virus, so they forced her really very much, and she could only use a permit 1 day by monthly, and in 24 hours at the latest she could come back. And there is a really very challenging psychological process. She cried, she insisted a lot, and after that she was provided with a 24 hours permit only. And also another woman which has a really very good relation with the employer, she is provided with a place, even a place during quarantine period. So this is independent from any legal structure, any institutional understanding. So this depends on arbitrary decisions and attitudes of the employers. And you know that the coping strategies of the women are mostly individual strategies, and they try to adapt themselves to the patterns of living, labor, and they try to find a leeway for themselves, and they try to manage the situation. They do not want to change it. They do not have any intention to change it. So, for example, the live-in workers rented some houses, and they could come together uh, during a day by singing songs, by cooking, by social activities jointly with other live-in house workers. So those live-in house workers come together and hire an apartment jointly for themselves, and they could use it at least 1 day a week for social purposes, for social activities. And also they have some opportunities to seek for new job opportunities during pandemics. For example, some of them says that I should have a really very significant and positive way of self-care, and self-defense strategies were developed by them. Social media becomes a very prominent item which they address, and they also get into contact with each other constantly and continuously via social media groups, especially via WhatsApp groups. And apart from that, we have such an interview, and she said that we support each other all the time. In case of in case I couldn't hear the voice of a friend 1 day, we should ask about ourselves, because apart from us, except ourselves, no one will ask our health, no one will ask if we are hungry or not. So we should support each other, but there isn't any institutional or legal mechanisms arranging that. And apart from that, or above all, withdrawal from Istanbul Convention leads to a really negative and adverse impact on the migrant women too. And you know that employment immerse outside of the labor law. So the labor law is not binding for them, and those rights conferred upon by the labor law could not be benefited from them. So they have some threats. They are dealing with some threats like being deported. So it is a really very important source of deterrence in order to get organized with or together with local workers and Turkish workers. So domestic workers, with regard to them, in terms of them, collective bargaining power is a really has really been decreased. And for example, when we get into contact with Istanbul unit of a trade union, we were kept informed that just one case, they have experienced just one case, a migrant worker came to that, but she says that I do not want to be a member of the trade union. She is a friend of a trade union member and she has lots of conditions beforehand. And I would like to express just one problem of mine, and I wonder if you could do anything about that or not. So she feels really very concerned, hesitant. So we are kept informed by such hesitant attitudes, avoidance, and fear of going out is a really very important problem in the beginning, especially because they experience uh, being a foreigner in the public spaces when they speak another language or look different. And for example, expensive costs of going out, cafes, restaurants, and therefore preference of coastal outdoor activities, picnic, park, beach could be used by them. And they are not only migrants, but they are also women on the other hand. So uh, people, most of them, in the, most of the interviewees says that they are always careful about what they wear, having an opinion about that. Some in some places dresses are suitable, in some places are not. And they are fear, there is a fear of femicide and not staying late at night. And also in Turkey, femicides, numbers of femicides are really very high. They say that we couldn't believe in the huge number of femicides in Turkey, and that's why we avoid of using public spaces in order to protect ourselves. Femicides is a really very important factor which creates fear amongst them too. And you know that they are irregular migrants, and this is a direct relation with the mobility, especially the bribery, offering bribery is not a bearable load, bearable burden for the women in economic terms. And you know that the women could move, uh, but if they come across encounter with the police, then they should pay a certain amount. So this is not something economically sustainable for them. And also we saw that they could go to work on a daily basis if they engage in daily works. But if they are living workers, then their mobility is restricted to a great extent. And if, for example, they send a cargo, if they want to send a cargo to the country of origin, is the reason for mobility, primary reason for mobility in urban spaces, or they could go to or visit each other at different neighborhoods where they work. And those are the rational and patterns behind the mobilities of them. And let me wrap it up. There is a complex combination of economic factors with gender discrimination as drivers of migration, and this is directly related with the welfare state and format it turned into within the course of time. and also houseworks or domestic works are underestimated and they do not get what they deserve, and gender inequalities are likely to be made worse by COVID-19 as disproportionately impact migrant women based on their migration status and the relationship between employee and employer, and that relation depends on our arbitrary decisions of the employer only, and the women are lack of any collective bargaining or political power against that. So each and every one of them should focus on individual strategies for discovering their own and self-coping strategies, and also spatial mobility that is gendered, gendered, it is limited, and also shaped by working experiences as practices as well as migration status reveals that gender equalities are specialized and they reproduce the urban space. And also gains and achievements of movement, not only for their families and children, but also for their own lives, underline women as agents of change instead of passive victims of the migration, as I underlined and highlighted previously. So we should take them into account as agents of change. I would like to thank you for your attention, and we could go on with questions, if any. Thank you very much, Zeynep. Yeah, we reconsidered so many things. You triggered our perspectives as well. I also have some questions, but beforehand, I would like to give the floor to the other participants if they have any questions, if they would like to exchange their own experiences, share their own experiences. They could make comments, ask questions. You could raise a hand. You could turn your mic and cam on and step in, jump in instantly and ask your questions. I guess there is a question on the chat box. This question is for Sarah from Akın Bodur. Are there any economic supports or projects undertaken by UN or European Union in order to take preventive measures against labor migration to Europe? Or are there any project implementation specific to the region? And apart from that, within the context of Arabic migration in between Arabic countries and Asia, what about language, beliefs, and differences in the culture or similarities in the culture, religions, and belief? And does it lead to any difference in terms of practice or approach of employers? Those migrants from Arabic countries which are heading towards Europe should obey provisions and legally binding items which is strictly set forth by Europe. But there could be some illegal migrations from northern uh, African countries or by through North African countries, Tunis, Algeria, for example, but there are strict rules set forth and applied by European countries, which does not permit them to engage in, to get involved in illegal or irregular migration. And from time to time, migrants even take the risk of losing their lives while having trips via boats to European countries, and some of them could not achieve their goals. Some of them were forced to stay in Tunis, Libya, or Algeria, or other Northern African countries, and some of them strive to cross borders of Italy or Spain, but indeed their most basic and intention or objective is not to stay in Northern African
countries, and they work in Arabic countries as illegal workers, and informal economy and sectors, informal sector, they are forced to work in informal sectors, and they couldn't get what they deserve in terms of rights. And I could say that European countries or Arabic countries could do not host those workers. They do not support such like workers, and their rights are violated everywhere, and they are not supported by European countries by all any means. And then the second part of the question, there could be some differences and similarities in terms of language, beliefs, cultures within the context of migration from Arabic countries to Asia, and are there any differences of in terms of attitudes and practices of employers?
أنا مش قادرة أفهم السؤال، يعني اختلاف بين أصحاب العمل بالجانب العربي وبالجانب الآسيوي؟
Evet, Asya ülkelerinden gelen ve Arap ülkelerinden gelen işçilere
Put it like that. Do employers treat different to behave different to those coming from Arabic countries and those coming from Asian countries, on given that their languages, beliefs, and cultures could be different from each other, or their languages, beliefs, or cultures could be similar to those of employers. As I said, in Middle Eastern region, in Arabic countries, there is a kafalet system, and migration results from lack of employment opportunities for migrants, and that's why they are forced to migrate to other countries. And in kafalet, the system is not a appropriate way of an employment system, but still they are forced to migrate because they couldn't find an opportunity of working at their homelands, and those are amongst the reasons of the migrations. But the government or the countries, if you take those into account, then their countries of origin, no matter what their countries of origin is, they are lack of any rights. Their rights are not protected on the basis of some agreements. So there is not any cooperation in between my country of the host country and the origin country of origin. There are some employment opportunities, but the destination country, the host country, employers benefited from their vulnerabilities and forced them to work under more challenging and unfavorable working conditions. They work in textiles and sector and agricultural sector under all terms. As far as I understand, I could answer your question like that. Anyone who would like to make a comment or ask a question apart from that? Maybe I could fill the gap and I could ask my own questions here. And at first, I would like to ask a question to Zeynep, and later on, I would like to ask a question to Sarah. In those questions could be asked to both of you, because those are indeed common questions addressing you. Women are not passive victims, but they should be perceived as agents of change, and Zeynep focused on that in terms of activism, and activists focus on such an understanding too. But on the other hand, women, I know that women fight in really several battlefields, so to say in rhetoric terms, So how can we say that they are not victims, and from which perspective we could indeed create our smooth ground to explain our standpoint for seeing the women not as women but agents of change. You know that domestic works, if you work in a precarious way, especially if you are a migrant worker, then we can say that they could be provided with that and employment opportunities, and they could work as long as they are healthy, and they will not have any, for example, pension fund or other social security benefits, for example. So what about their own lives? Once they quit the job and return to their country or stay at the host country, what are their experiences after quitting employment process, uh, since they are aged or due to other reasons? I know this is not related, directly related to their to your study, but still maybe we could get some hints about that. Sarah has a really very wide range experience with regard to organization, especially, and we know that in Turkey, the trade unions, the condition of trade conditions, the condition of trade unions are really very bad in terms of migrant workers, and even those workers could be registered or could be employed in informal sector, and they could even be deemed to be, for example, violators of the strikes as strike breakers, for example. So what is your opinion about that? I would like to ask that question especially to Sarah. And if, for example, you would like to make any comments, please go ahead. Zeynep, let's start with you.
Öyle ben aslında biraz hani korka da söylüyorum. Çünkü
I
gerçekten
would like
hakikaten o
to
kadar
say that
gerçekten
hesitantly, because you know that there is a huge exploitative condition to which they are subjected. I am, of course, talking about the women migrants working in care sector. But still, we couldn't explain the entirety of the story if we just focus them as we just express them as victims. Because we can say that they have an achievement story. They have some gainings, even though she will lose all of them once she quit employment processes, right? But still, for example, in the meantime, their children could access to education. So employment opportunities of the women, even though employment opportunities are precarious, lead to children to be provided with the training and educational opportunities. So there is a transformative potential, but there are some restrictions about that as well. And those restrictions should also be addressed. We should include that into our research too. And you know that all of them in the last phase is directly related to the individual conditions of a certain person, peculiarly, specifically. And we can say that they also make some investments. We saw that women could buy uh, an apartment, or they could have a house built or constructed. So once they return to their country, they would like to stay at their home without the concern of how I can pay my rent this month. But of course, none of them made mention of accessing social securities, pension funds, etc. their primary gainings could be in two different ways. First, they could buy a property or pay a already existing debt, or on the second hand, as a second item, they could spend the money for the training of the children, for the educational process of the training. Of course, uh, the expenditures are not arranged in accordance with the desires of the women. There is a really very complex and comprehensive bargaining process which was going on. And they leave their children behind, and those children are accompanied by some people of their own. And those people could have their own desires and wishes. So there is a bargaining and deal was reached as a result. And this is indeed an equality based on gender issues, based on migration issues. So those frameworks are set forth as their result. In order to go beyond them, in order to go over that, they should come together as huge numbers, and they should turn into be an organized power. And I would like to lend an ear to Sarah and her experiences, and I already heard about the experiences of image and organizational side of the story is a really very challenging one, and it is not so much promising. I can say that if there are some strong and favorable stories, I would like to lend an ear to Sarah so as to get motivated.
بالنسبة للشق الأول من السؤال كيف يكونوا
In the
النساء
first
وهذه
part of the
الفئات
question,
يعني وكلاء للتغيير
migrant workers at home, domestic
مهم جدا إنه
workers,
في
how could
مهارات
they
مميزة لتحسين
get
الحياة
involved in
المهنية
transformation processes? It
إنه
is
نلمس
really very
كيف
important. They should
النساء
feel sympathy to each other.
كمثل
They should support
للصراعات
each
اللي
other,
بيعانوا
and
منها
they should,
لكن الأهم من ذلك إنه نعمل
of
على
course, we should lend an ear to
إعادة
them, their stories
إعادة
as
عمل على
victims.
ضمير
Right, on the one hand, this is true, but on the other hand, we
الاهتمام
should
إنه يكون
get them organized. We
تنظيم
should
المنتديات
strive for
الهجرة اللي عم
that,
بيصيروا حاليا
and
مع
also
تسمية
we
الهجرة
should make their voices
يعني
heard
الهجرة
in
دون
each and
حدود
every forum. The
تنظيم
same is
الهجرة
true for
للعائلات المهاجرات
migration forums,
إنه
international agreements, and international sessions.
مناقشة
So domestic workers,
العاملة
their
الهجرة
voices are not
والمهارات
heard
التي
internationally or
تتبنى تجربة
domestically. So
الهجرة
while we are discussing about the international migration
وتطوير
agreement,
فعاليات إسقاط
your
المهاجرين المهارات
representation should also be provided, and also
والعابرين بحقهم
stakeholders
إنه
and
نعمل
interest
على
owners
تنظيم
should come
هؤلاء
together in order to advocate and
وضمان
defend their rights,
تنظيم
and we should
منتديات
uh,
الهجرة
get
نعمل على
them
تنظيم
organized, promote them to get organized indeed, and
المنطقة
they should
العربية
be represented in every
كافة للأهمية
platforms, and we should
لتنظيم النقابات
restructure
المهنية
them as a
والنقابات
power.
العمالية
And
وهي
in
أيضا
Arabic
صراعات
countries, migrant workers are
تسمح
deprived
لهم
of getting organized, and they are not permitted to be a member of a
لكن
trade
للأسف
union.
الاقتصاد
They could
اللبناني
not
في
be
أغلبها اقتصاد
affiliated
فيها
to
نقابات
trade
عمالية
unions, but in
فما
some
باله بقى
certain
نشأة
countries, they could only be members of local trade unions, but in most of the countries, Arabic countries, trade unions are not active already. They are not active under given conditions.
تنظيم
In
المجتمعات
Arabic
المهنية
countries,
والشبكات
some
العمالية
NGOs are trying to adopt alternative frames in order to get those settled in the territory, in the country, in Bahrain, Qatar, Tunis, and Morocco, for example. Those kind of networks are getting organized informally, and also uh, they are uh, this is not for engaging in social and cultural activities. This is not for celebrating official holidays, for example, or official festivals. That's not the rationale of that. They try to improve working conditions and labor rights. And on the other hand, there are some NGOs, civil society organizations who take on responsibility in this respect to get them organized, but those are informal, hidden works, hidden processes, but still workers, migrant workers in Arabic countries could not declare their organizational activities instantly, otherwise they could be deported all of a sudden. So protests, demonstrations, boycotts could not be permitted for them. There are lack of such like opportunities. And on the other hand, they should be furnished with social security opportunities and informal economy sector, inclusive of agricultural sector. They are not provided with insurance coverage and social security coverage. So independent trade unions and NGOs mobilize some campaigns, and thanks to such like campaigns, it is requested to provide agricultural workers with the coverage of social security insurance, and also domestic workers, for example, in live-in domestic workers. We are working on that now. They are not subjected to social security under Jordanian laws, but they could only be subjected to social security benefits and opportunities under the decision, in line with the decision of the prime minister only. And we should also fight for them in an organized way in order them to get the rights they reserve. And I guess now there will be a question from Farah Abdullah because she raised her hand. You could ask your question after turning your mic and camera. Farah Abdullah, if you want.
Hi, hello, can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. I'm Farhal Abdullah from the Quest Regional Center for Refugees and Migrants.
Çok
And
teşekkür.
I actually
Could you
have a
please repeat your question because I should change my headphone? Okay. Could you please repeat your question? Thank you very much.
Of course, thank you. I actually have a comment here. Maybe one of the major problems we are facing in regarding migrants and migration, it's more like a cultural problem, which is not treating migrants and refugees as fellow human beings. And this is pushing towards having, in a way, more racism, having more tension between societies, and not recognizing in a way that other people do have similar rights to us. They are humans, they need access to their rights. And if it wasn't for the situation that they were living in their origin country, they would not have moved and sought refuge in a way, or seek safety or better living conditions in other countries. It is not them to blame, it's not migrants to blame, it is not refugees to blame, it is governments who failed at providing good policies and good regulations to regulate migration and the flow of refugees. So in such cases, we need to focus more on advocacy activities, on whom to address, whom do we need to address, whom do we need to contact, and what do we need to call for? Because we have all of these problems, whether talking about migrant women, migrant men, refugees, and we see rising tension in all societies between refugees and the citizens of the country, between migrants and the citizens of the country, and perspective of migrants and refugees being there to take the jobs of the people of the country. So we see the rising tension, and the policies of the government has led in a way to the rise of these tensions, because there is not regulations. We do not have regulation to regulate activities, to regulate migration. So this is what we need to push for. And we need to push for more awareness among people to know that we are fellow humans. If no one would leave a safe place to go to another place. So thank you so much.
Farah, çok teşekkürler katkınız için.
Thank
Bu
you
konu
very much for your contribution. I am not sure if our guests would like to jump in this topic or not, if there are any further questions and comments.
Ufak bir şey söylemek
I
istiyorum.
like to say something in brief only without taking much of your time. Those indeed
Göçmenlerin bir ülkeden bir başka ülkeye
struggles
gelmesi
should be connected with each other.
anlayabileceğimiz bir
Migrants
şey değil.
flee away from a country to another. Yes, but this is not the only part of the story. It's not the single part of the story. You know that there are diverse groups and there is a decrease in salaries. Some certain diverse groups could shift the blame over the other party. But here, the labor classes, worker classes, so the lower income groups should get organized with each other in a collective way so as to produce a really very productive response. And as a result of that, they could all get gainings and fruitful outputs. And this is also true for domestic workers. Their gainings and benefits could be supported with the collective bargaining. If they get the right of collective bargaining, they could take really fruitful steps forward and take fruitful actions. And I would like to ask a very, very brief question. In production sectors, workshops, or other public spaces, we could say that the labor, the other than the domestic labor, we could generally characterize my point like that. You know that there is a combating structure, rival structure. So workers are observed as rivals of each other, competitors of each other. Their interests are conflicting with each other. So is there any, for example, hostility in between domestic workers, or is there any way of pursuing their interests as conflicting with each other if you take the domestic workers of country of origin or domestic workers of the host community and migrant workers into account? Do they perceive that their conflicts are conflicting with each other, their interests are conflicting with each other, or complementary? What kind of a perception is in place in this respect? I am a lack of any comprehensive knowledge in this respect. You know that the migrant workers mostly prefer to be employed in living domestic work so that they could be free from rent costs. And also they turn into be a more advantageous personnel in the eye of employers because they accept to work as living employees, workers. But the host community domestic workers mostly prefer to be employed in daytime works only, but not living services. But when I get into contact with the image, that trade union, we can say that such like conflict could be a really very rigid one in the agricultural sector, especially. Agricultural sector, we could see the hostility in a concrete way. And also racism could be observed in a really very rigid and concrete way, tangible way. But with regard to domestic care works, domestic working practices, the working segments of the society are subjected to a great level of inflation, and you know that there is a shrinkage in the economy, and all those conditions will lead us to get to a point, but I am not sure what that point would be in terms of the relation in between host community domestic workers and migrant domestic workers. We could not anticipate it exactly and obviously, but I can say that that result will not be a positive or affirmative one. I could just say that. And apart from that, once in the trade union, they mention migrants and migrating workers, migrant workers, refugee workers. For example, women filed a complaint and they said that those women said that once migrants come to our country, because of them, our salaries has a decrease. Yes, but in return, trade union representatives say that yes, uh, prices have decreased, right? But everyone is in need of livelihoods. You do the same. If you couldn't find an employment opportunity for a long time, then you accept to work in exchange for lower salaries. So you also decrease that amount yourself. The important thing here is that you should all be provided with fair working opportunities in conformity with the dignity, human dignity. And if Farah, Sarah, would you like to make any comment here with regard to the condition which is available in Jordan now, which is present in Jordan now?
العمالة المهاجرة العمل المنزلي يعني نسبة الأردنيات اللي بيشتغلوا في هذا القطاع ضئيلة جدا وبالإضافة إلى إنه في عنا ثقافة
the locals, those community member women do not work as servants commonly. That work is not respected, underestimated. So the host community members, the women of those community, do not accept to work in domestic works. Even if they work in domestic works, they refuse to express that because this is a source of shame for them, so to say. Maybe there could be some competition in between them and the domestic workers of among the migrants, women, but it is not expressed, it is not explicit. So they do not work in the same sector. But the struggle here is to combine their benefits, and the aim is to provide a certain way of level of homogeneity in between salaries. But if you take the conditions into account, salaries into account, if you get organized, then you could get more benefits without any discrimination to the third extent possible. So yeah, it is alike indeed, it is similar. In Turkish world, the women also do not want to work in living domestic work. This is the reason for separating their professions characteristically. Living domestic works and daytime domestic workers are separated from each other in Turkey too. Anyone who would like to make a complaint? Now it is 9 o'clock. Our time is already over, and I would like to say that I enjoyed a lot from the program. I learned a lot too. I would like to thank to Zeynep and Sarah. I look forward to seeing and witnessing your further studies, and I will keep an eye and lend an ear to your studies from now on as well. And I would like to thank the Kırkayak team for this 4-week series of events, and we could lend an ear to successive perspectives in a really very fruitful way. So thank you very much for having us. Thank you very much for your invitation too. And now I'd like to give the floor to you if you would like to close the session. Thank you very much. and this is a really very fruitful one. And I can say that we will issue a report on the basis of the activities we have conducted together in cooperation with Lulufer. We conducted a study, and that study is related to the Gaziantep and Istanbul-based migrant workers. And I could say that I am really very happy to be together with you today too. And thanks for your time. Goodbye. Good evening.